Hola a todos, Dan here. This is our second in a series of videos examining the most powerful study methods available to Spanish learners today. According to polyglots around the world, this method is the method preferred by your brain. According to them, it is the fastest way to true conversational fluency. I call it Spanish straight into your brain. What if I told you you could learn Spanish or any other language without bothering with studying the endless grammatical rules or going through hours of tedious, mind-numbing drills? Well, today's method promises just that. In fact, according to Stephen Krashan, language acquisition does not require extensive use of conscious grammatical rules and does not require tedious drill. Who is Stephen Krashan? Stephen Krashan is a PhD linguist and professor emeritus at University of Southern California. He's authored over 486 publications in the field of second language acquisition, bilingual education, and reading. But his greatest claim to fame is his theory of second language acquisition, which has 5 hypotheses. The first is the acquisition learning hypothesis, which basically states that learning is less important than acquiring a language. This is probably the most famous of the 5 and is known worldwide. Krashan teaches that there are 2 ways to approach a foreign language: the acquired way and the learned way. The acquired way, or acquisition, happens subconsciously and is very much like the natural process a child has when learning their first language. It requires interesting interaction in the target language, what Krashan calls natural communication, and the most important concern is communicating. The learned way, on the other hand, or learning, comes through formal instruction, and it comprises a conscious process where the student receives information about the language, for example, knowledge of grammar rules. Krashan teaches that it is better for you to acquire a language naturally than to attempt to learn a language. The second hypothesis is called the input hypothesis, and we're going to focus on it today, so we'll talk more about that in a moment. The third hypothesis is called the monitor hypothesis. When a student must learn portions of grammar consciously, Krashan says it should only be used as a self-monitor or a form of self-editing. Krashan says that this can only be beneficial when 3 conditions are met. First, the second language learner has sufficient time at their disposal. Second, they focus on form or think about correctness. Third, they know the rule. The entire purpose of the conscious learning, or using the monitor process, is so that the second language student can correct minor deviations from normal speech and to give speech a more polished appearance. He insists that the role should be minor and warns that a person with a lack of self-confidence is overusing the monitor function and that extroverts underuse the monitor function. The fourth, the affective filter hypothesis, is Krashan's view that a number of affective variables have a part to play in learning a second language, specifically motivation, self-confidence, anxiety, and personality traits. Krashan claims that learners with high motivation, self-confidence, a good image, a low level of anxiety, and extroversion are better equipped for success in acquiring a second language. Low motivation, low self-esteem, anxiety, introversion, and inhibition can increase the affective filter and form a mental block that prevents comprehensible input from being used for acquisition. Another way to look at this is like this. When your guard or your filter is up, it hinders your ability to acquire a second language. You need a good attitude, plus more, to become conversationally fluent. The last hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis, is based on research findings which suggest that there is a predictable order in which you will acquire grammar, that some grammar is acquired early and that other parts are gathered later in the process. His main point here is don't worry about it at all. It will come when it comes. So let's get into the input hypothesis, which is the basis for the comprehensible input study method. This hypothesis is Krashan's explanation of how second language acquisition takes place. The input hypothesis is only concerned with acquisition, not learning. Krashan states that in order to cause a second language acquisition to occur, it's necessary for learners to understand the input language. That's called comprehensible input, which contains linguistic terms that are slightly beyond the learner's present linguistic competence. Now, we're going to deal more about this in just a moment, but let's listen to Stephen Krashan talk about it.
Is that for language acquisition to happen, you need input, you need input that has two characteristics. It should be comprehensible and it should be interesting. Because if it's not interesting, no one's going to pay attention to it.
So you heard that Krashan teaches that in order to acquire a second language, learners must receive input that's comprehensible. In other words, at a level that the student can understand. But the input must not just be comprehensible. It must also be compelling. It must be able to capture and maintain the student's interest. To illustrate this point, he brought forward the concept of the I+1 principle. I+1 means that the language that the learners are exposed to should be far enough beyond their current competence so that they can understand most of it but still be challenged enough to make progress. The input must neither be too difficult nor too easy to understand. The learner's I is the learner's current level of second language, and the +1 is how the learner gets to the next level by adding new input and relating it to the input the learner has already acquired. Used by license from Spanish with Paul, here's an example of comprehensible input instruction that takes a beginner student in Spanish and introduces new information to begin the acquisition process. Watch this with me.
Hello everyone, this is Paul from SpanishWithPaul.com and welcome to this 1-hour Spanish course for beginners. It's very important that you interact with the course and that whenever I ask a question, you pause to think out your answer. So don't just sit back and listen to it passively because you really won't get the best results from doing that. So with all that said, let's jump straight into it. The word for it is in Spanish is simply es, spelled E-S. And the word for normal is normal. So exactly the same spelling, just we change the pronunciation to normal. How would you say it's normal? Es normal.
So that is a great example of exposing the learner, in this case a beginner student, to information that is just beyond their current competence. They're able to understand most of it, and they're challenged to make progress. Now, to make this personal, what is your current level of knowledge in your target language? Or to use Krashan's terminology, what is your I? To properly use the comprehensible input method, you must start where your I, or your knowledge level, is at. Are you a new beginner with no prior exposure to the language? Or are you a false beginner? A false beginner is someone who has studied this language before and is returning to it. Are you intermediate? Are you advanced? In order to use this study method properly, you have to know what level you are at and find comprehensible and compelling input that challenges you to continue to the next level of acquisition. Let's compare traditional methods to the comprehensible input method. With comprehensible input, language acquisition comes naturally. With traditional methods, language acquisition comes artificially. The class proceeds whether you're ready or not, whether you understand it or not. With comprehensible input, language acquisition is personal. It's based on building on your current level of knowledge. With traditional methods, language acquisition is technical. It's based on a lesson plan. With comprehensible input, language acquisition has a priority on speaking the language quickly. Speak what you know. Don't worry about errors. With traditional methods, language acquisition has a priority on the written. It insists on proper structures in it. With comprehensible input, language acquisition focuses on using the language, practicing what you've acquired regularly. With traditional methods, language acquisition has a priority on theory, understanding grammar and structure first. With comprehensible input, language acquisition occurs through meaningful, comprehensible, and compelling interaction with the language. With traditional methods, language acquisition occurs via formal instruction, whether or not in the classroom. This formal instruction can be via program, the internet, or classroom settings. With comprehensible input, language acquisition occurs as a result of coaching, where the learner is guided to a process of rule discovery, where grammar is found, it is mentioned, and it's rapidly pointed out, and then you move along. With traditional methods, language acquisition occurs as a result of rule-driven teaching, where grammar is king. With comprehensible input, language acquisition is centered on the learner and where they're at in the process. But with traditional methods, language acquisition is centered on a preset syllabus that was not designed with that particular student in mind and regardless of their learner type. With comprehensible input, language acquisition is not concerned with translation, but keeps the learner in the target language and not in the learner's language. With traditional methods, language acquisition has translation as the main driver, where the learner is constantly bringing the target language back into their primary language, their L1, language 1. With comprehensible input, language acquisition activities are based in the target language, or L2. With traditional methods, language acquisition activities are about the target language. It's an important nuanced distinction. With comprehensible input, language acquisition focuses on communicating, regardless of errors. With traditional methods, language acquisition focuses on proper grammatical forms and structures again. With comprehensible input, language acquisition produces ability. It is used by polyglots around the world. With traditional methods, language acquisition produces knowledge of a language, but not an ability. In addition to the Spanish with Paul example we saw, there are many other Spanish language teachers on the internet who use the comprehensible input method. Here are three. Español con Juan, with Juan Fernandez, is an excellent Spanish-only comprehensible input system on YouTube. His method requires a relatively higher I, or knowledge level, from its students to follow along. But the diversity of his programs cover a wide spectrum of comprehensible and compelling information that will help those who have acquired a low intermediate level of Spanish to grow. The Spanish Tutor with Dr. Danny Evans, like Spanish with Paul, uses both Spanish and English. Due to his wide coverage of topics, learners ranging from a low I to a high I will benefit from his lessons, which have both comprehensible and compelling content. Spanglish Fantastico with Ruth Darby is a new YouTube Spanish teacher who also uses both Spanish and English in a seamless blend. Users with a low I or knowledge base will find her courses comprehensible and compelling, and the range of real-life topics that she covers will also attract higher I students. Polyglots all over the world praised the comprehensible input method of Stephen Krashan. One of the most widely known polyglots who has created a business based on the comprehensible input method is Steve Kaufmann. Steve Kaufmann is a former diplomat, a famous polyglot who speaks at conferences worldwide, a well-known YouTuber, and is currently fluent in over 20 languages. He offers a unique interpretation of the comprehensible input method. Kaufmann says that there are 3 keys to language learning. They are attitude, time, and noticing. With attitude, Kaufmann insists that the motivation of the language learner toward learning the language is of paramount importance. If you are not highly motivated to learn, you will fail. Kaufmann's second key is time. He says that the amount of time that you dedicate with the language will determine how fast you learn a language. The key is with the language. With the language. Kauffman says that you must be exposed to comprehensible input that includes information that presses you forward. That's the I+1 formula of Stephen Krashan. Kaufman's third key is noticing. He teaches that a language student, in order to be successful, must be able to notice the nuances of the language, must be able to notice new words, must be able to notice when a structure is slightly different. Here's a focused look. First, your attitude affects your learning. Motivation is a major requirement to learn. The material you study must capture your attention. Now look, when you feel like you're stagnated, move on, and then come back when that knowledge of information seems to wane or go away. Kaufmann teaches that the quantity of time with the language is a key to success. Things that affect the quality of time to your new language are familiarity of the new language to your current language. If you can recognize the letter system and basic syntax, Kaufmann says, you're ahead of the game. The actual time with the language is a key to success. Those who can spend 10 hours a day immersed in a language and those who use this method will rapidly learn the language, Kaufmann says. Those who can only spend 30 minutes to an hour a day should not be discouraged when they're not fluent in a year. Kaufmann teaches that deliberate practice with vocabulary that has signs or lettering systems different than your own is a must. If the language system is different, Kaufmann teaches that you must use the deliberate practice method to learn those different characters. This is for languages such as Greek, Russian, and Chinese, just as an example. Kaufmann believes that reading is important to developing vocabulary and should be one of the main drivers in your language acquisition. Reading new and interesting material every day is critical. He says that vocabulary is king to achieve fluency. In fact, he says the more vocabulary you know, the quicker you will find yourself fluent. And he encourages students to self-assess about distractions that keep them from study. He asks them to question whether they're totally devoted to learning a new language to the point of even being a fanatic. Kaufmann teaches that good language students are noticers. They notice things about the language. For example, they notice vocabulary that is similar to theirs, such as cognates. He teaches the more you understand, the more you will learn. Again, that's that I+1 Krashan method. He encourages language students to develop their ability to notice patterns or words that they don't recognize, to notice those words and to learn them, and to add them to their vocabulary. So Kaufmann summarizes his requirements for language students as this. 1, you have to be motivated. 2, you have to be disciplined. 3, you have to be a self-starter. 4, you have to be curious about things. And 5, you have to have the confidence, the real belief that you can succeed. You have to be able to see yourself as fluent one day. However, Kaufmann does not believe that for the average language student who cannot immerse in a language or whose study time is limited can achieve fluency rapidly. He insists that you shouldn't worry about how long the path to fluency is. He teaches that there's many factors that influence how fast a person can become fluent. Instead, he encourages you to enjoy the process, keep challenging yourself, and don't worry about making mistakes or forgetting vocabulary or obsessing over grammatical rules. These things are natural in the comprehensible input learning method, and despite the sensation at the time, you are learning more than you realize. Here is his opinion about those who say they can become fluent rapidly.
That Benny Lewis has announced that he is going to become fluent in Chinese in 3 months. Now, right off the bat, let's make it very clear that that is pure nonsense. Talk a little more about Benny. Benny is his approach is that he claims to travel the world, spend 3 months in different places, and spend maybe an initial few hours or a day going over some language book, and then throwing that away and just going out and talking to people, and that way he becomes fluent in 3 months, which I consider to be nonsense.
The comprehensible input method focuses on input over output. It teaches that output will come naturally when and as it is needed. It teaches that as a student progresses in knowledge, the grammar monitor will develop, and that fixation on that too early can actually inhibit the acquisition process, according to Stephen Krashan, Steve Kauffman, and others who use this method. It teaches that speech will come and improve as knowledge and exposure with the language does, as will writing and total fluency. The comprehensible study method insists that the process should be natural and enjoyable, compelling to you, the learner. I want to thank you for watching. Please send me your questions to dailylearningjournal@gmail.com or post your comments below. Also, please like this video and hit the subscribe button now. And join us next time for the third and final video in this study method series. Hasta luego.